All right, welcome. We're at a different time today, 2 hours earlier than usual, and we are 3 weeks after the previous one due to some schedule changes. So glad to see that so many folks could make it, and hopefully, yeah, thanks. Igor just posted saying thanks for your time. You're welcome. Hopefully this works better for folks in Europe. I think probably next meeting will be back to the regular time. We'll probably try and alternate or switch between them at some frequency, since I know this doesn't work for folks in Asia. So the next meeting is going to be 1 p.m. Pacific on February 26th. And we'll send out emails about that as well. Cool. So for the agenda for today, we had a bunch of things that are, most of these are kind of updates on previous projects and things that are in progress that you wanted to make folks aware of and just have a space for discussion in addition to the existing like mailing lists and pull requests and whatnot. So to kick it off, I asked Paul to give an update on redacted send and receive and where you're at with code reviews on that.
Hi, everyone. So there are not currently, so redacted send receive has been in pull request state for a while now, something on the order of about 4 months. It's been broken up into smaller commits a couple times to try to make it easier to review. And right now, I've sort of divided the work into chunks, which can be sort of independently reviewed, which are on the order of a couple thousand lines. We still need people to review these chunks. We have a couple people have taken sort of a partial look at it on GitHub. And I've talked to some people on Slack who've said that, once release stabilization is done, they may have time to take a look at things, but we could really use more volunteers to help sort of keep this ball rolling and try to get this large feature landed to minimize sort of code churn and rebasing and stuff like that.
Brian, if you're on, can you speak to like if you would accept this in before you tag 0.8, or once it has enough reviews, or if not, then what's the schedule for 0.8?
Yeah, I'm here. The goal is to get 0.8 out as soon as possible. So I would think redacted send and receive would miss it because we want to get it out. We wouldn't want to block waiting on it. So the hope is to get 0.8 out this month, early next month. The only thing holding it up is the trim work we would like to get in there for FreeBSD. So we aren't carrying those patches. So soon, so I would hope redacted trim receive, we'd be in a position to put it in after that.
Okay.
And I saw the question on the chat, which was answered, but I'll just kind of give some context here about plans to upstream it to Illumos. So we originally did this work on Illumos, and we've actually had a pull request out on OpenZFS Illumos for, I don't know, a year. Paul, is that right?
More, a year and a half, something like that.
And I think that the issue was that, because both this and encryption have major changes to the send receive code and restructuring it, we thought we were being polite by rebasing our code, the redacted send and receive stuff on top of encryption, so that encryption could go in first and not have to deal with the restructuring that we were doing. But encryption is taking a lot longer than expected to get into Illumos. So I think like it's once encryption goes into Illumos, that pull request is epsilon from being ready to be integrated. It would just need the same sort of code reviews that's happening on Linux, and the code is pretty similar, pretty much the same. How much differences are there, Paul, between once you're on top of encryption, Illumos versus?
The differences are very small once you're on top of encryption. There's, I think, a couple of small changes in terms. There's like a couple things where it has to interact with sort of some platform-specific stuff involving threading and stuff like that. But those changes are dozens of lines. I mean, it's not very much at all.
Okay. Cool. So to answer Igor's question there, like there's already an open PR on OpenZFS. It's just that it's on top of the encryption stuff. So Brian, I heard you say that you want to basically you want to tag O.8 first. You want to get trim in.
Yep.
I didn't hear a date. I heard very soon, but can you give like an approximate, like what does very soon mean to you? Like a week, a month, 6 months?
A month or two, I would say, top. I would say I would like to have it out by the end of February, but probably it will be March. So soon, because it is pretty much ready. There were some other changes we talked about for some bug fixes. There's that one encryption issue Tom is working on that we need to get in, but soon.
Okay. Cool. Any more? I think that's a good transition to the trim update. But is there any other questions on that? All right, cool. Then Brian, do you want to talk about where you're at with the trim code? What's going on with that?
Sure. I've picked up the work that Tim Chase was doing on trim that was based on the work that Nexenta did. And basically, I've just spent the last week pushing it forward, just bringing it up to date with all the cool new stuff that we've added to ZFS in the last couple of years. The original Nexenta patch was written before a lot of this functionality, so it just needed to be updated to take advantage of a lot of the new stuff, like the new style ioctals and per leaf VDEV zaps, that kind of thing. So I've done most of that mechanical work to get it ready. And I'm hoping to have something ready for reviews that takes advantage of all that by the end of the week. So I'm beating the bushes for reviewers too. If anyone is interested and can help with that, I can point them at the pull request when it's ready.
Yeah, I'll definitely take another look at the pull request.
So as part of that restructuring too, I've tried to make the code basically consistent with what was done for VDEV initialize as much as possible, to not have duplicate functionality. So this is in the spirit of what Nexenta did, but just cleaned up to be realigned with the latest stuff in the code.
All right, cool. So all you're not changing really the functionality that it's providing, but just kind of what's happening under the hood to do that in terms of like there's like the explicit trim, there's the continuous trim, and a couple settings around that.
Yeah, basically. So all the basic functionality is still maintained in the same way. The only thing I did that would really be user visible is I aligned the CLI options and the status reporting with how VDEV initialize works, because they're basically the same operation. It seemed reasonable to me that they should basically be presented the same to the user.
Cool.
So,
all right. Questions on trim status? All right. Josh Pitzel, can you give an update on we had a discussion couple of meetings ago about the default pool features to enable, and thanks for taking the AI to lead that discussion. Can you give us an update on where that has gone? Are you still muted? Josh, we can't hear you.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, because I'm in Silicon Valley, I have hideous internet, and I'm using a phone to dial in. So sorry about that. I unmuted myself in the app, and that didn't follow through to the phone. So we did a bunch of back and forth. There's been a lot of different proposals about what the UI for that feature would look like. There's been a lot of different proposals about how it should be implemented. I think we have sort of collapsed down to a reasonable proposal that most people are either happy with or willing to sign off on. I can share that proposal. It's pretty long, but I was thinking maybe I would just send it out as an email. I'm prepared to share it on my screen, but it's a couple pages of stuff.
Right.
Do you want to see it, or should I just send a summary of where we're at?
I mean, I would say we had a big discussion about it when we first brought it up in this meeting. So why don't you send it out in an email, and then if that'll give folks a chance to take their time reading it, and then if there's questions or contention, then we'll have a discussion about it at the next meeting.
Okay, perfect. I'll do that. The one thing that didn't really get considered is boot pools. So somebody on the mailing thread to the OpenZFS mailing list brought up the point of boot pools, and it never really went anywhere. But at least on FreeBSD, at least in releases past, there's been a fairly significant divergence between what you could boot off of and what you could import. And I don't know what sort of monkey wrench that throws into the proposal. If we want to have separate handling for boot pools, if we want to consider those at all, or if we just want to pretend that's a non-issue, because quite frankly, what a system can boot off of, continuously gets closer to what OpenZFS supports.
Yeah, I mean, you're basically talking about mostly we're talking about the bootloader and what does the bootloader support.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea in terms of, I assume the idea would be to have some kind of way of saying, I want to create a pool that doesn't have any features enabled that can't be used by this version of the bootloader or whatever.
Yeah, which is more complicated than, for instance, like on FreeBSD, I can't remember if this got added, but the bootloader used to not understand skying checksumming, right? So you could switch the checksumming to skying, but then you couldn't boot off of it. I mean, that's a pretty subtle change, but I don't know I don't even know what the Linux landscape looks like. And of course, the FreeBSD landscape changes quite rapidly, because you might think that not being able to boot off of a feature is kind of a bug. So people are constantly adding that functionality.
Yeah, I mean, in my opinion, I think that not solving that problem right now is okay. I think that we should move forward with this even without a real solution to that. But it does sound useful. So if you or somebody else wants to work on adding that to the proposal, then I think that's great as well.
Okay. Yeah, it seems sort of it would not be expected if you create a ZOL pool with features portable and then go to boot,
You might not be able to boot from it on FreeBSD, for example.
Right. Which I guess at the end of the day, if you think about it, maybe that's not as big of a deal as it sounds like, because as you run through, you go think of what you'd have to jump through to make a pool that was bootable in both Linux and FreeBSD, anyways.
Yes, we are in fact jumping through these hoops to make pools that can boot from both Illumos and Linux. So it is possible, but booting is definitely kind of a special. It's kind of a special case. Because there is so much operating system specific stuff going on there. So for that reason, I don't think that it's a core requirement that we solve it here.
Perfect. Okay. Well then, I'll send an email with basically the condensation of that very large thread down to what the consensus seems to be, so that we can iterate over it.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
I know on FreeBSD previously we had a warning if you tried to enable a feature, or even having skying but enabled but not active was fine, but if it was active then it was a problem or whatever. And so when you tried to ZFS set it on a system that had bootfs set, it would give an error or something. I don't know if it's something we can have a more formal version of that to warn a user when they try to do something that's going to make the system unbootable or anything like that. Yeah,
Illumos has similar things to that. I think the idea would be to make that a little bit more formalized if we were to extend this the compatible features proposal. Cool. anything else on this topic? Well, thanks a lot, Josh, for leading that discussion and writing up the consensus.
You're welcome.
So the next two things that I have on the agenda are exciting feature removals. The first, and I propose both of these, so I'll kind of give you some background. These are both been posted on the mailing list, but wanted to give folks another chance to chime in. So the first is removing dedupe Dido. So when you're using dedupe, by default, like you can have 1 million copies of a block, and we just store 1 block for it. So you get like 1,000,000 to 1, space savings. You can optionally set this dedupe Dido property on the pool. So you can do like zpool set dedupe Dido equals 100, and then that basically tells ZFS if you have more than 100 copies of this, like all get deduped away, then actually I want to keep 2 copies of it on disk rather than just the 1. And actually I think there's some like exponential scale up. So like if you have like 100 times 100 copies, that or 100 times 100 versions that dedupe away, then it'll go to 3 copies of your data. Most folks are probably unaware of this functionality, and it turns out that it didn't actually work right because these like the extra copies that were kept as a result of the dedupe Dido setting were not correctly scrubbed. So like if you happen to read it, then you would get it, but and it would do like correction then. But if you like do a resilver or a scrub, say, then you could lose it wouldn't actually resilver the dedupe Dido block. So thanks to Brian for figuring that out and then also actually fixing the issue. But kind of when this issue was brought up, I was reminded of like how this code is very not very used, and apparently hasn't been very useful until Brian made that fix. So my proposal was to leave the property intact. So if anybody has scripts that are setting it or whatever, then that'll continue to like exit 0, but it wouldn't do anything anymore. So we wouldn't create any new dedupe Dido blocks, but the software would still know how to deal with existing dedupe Dido blocks, and it would free them correctly, when we're done with them, etc. So this is not. It saves a little bit of code. It's a rare pull request that actually removes core kernel code, but it's not a huge amount of code removal. But I thought that it was probably worth doing just because we've seen the bugs that it has caused bugs and test failures, and rather not have to deal with that on a continual basis. So I think most of the feedback that I got so far was positive. I got, I think, some neutral feedback from feedback that I would classify as neutral. Maybe he would disagree, from Tom Caputi. I don't know if you're on the call. I don't see his name here. But just wanted to give anybody else the opportunity to thumbs up, thumbs down. If anybody's actually using this and like thinks that it's useful for them, I would love to hear about that. All right.
I read the proposal and it sounded good to me.
Okay, thanks, Josh. I love resounding silence when proposing removing stuff.
I think it's honestly pretty hard to build an economically viable system that makes good use of the dedupe stuff.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I'm not surprised that there's not a avalanche of, no, please, I'm using that. Like, yeah.
I agree. Yes. Thank you, Alec. I will. Cool. Any other thoughts on dedupe Dido before we move on to the next exciting feature removal? Cool. So the next one is a little bit of a different case. So we added ZFS remap. As part of the device removal feature that was relatively recently added, I added subcommand ZFS remap. The idea here was that when you do device removal, we keep track of the mapping from the old locations to the new locations on disk. And we also have to keep that in memory. And in some cases, it can take up a lot of memory. So originally I added this ZFS remap command that would let you say, hey, like I want to proactively go and touch all the indirect blocks in this file system, causing them all to be rewritten, pointing directly to the new locations. And then in theory, that would allow, once nobody's using the mapping anymore, then we can get rid of it and reduce the memory. In practice, for this to happen, first off, you have to either not have any snapshots or you have to remove all the old snapshots because we aren't modifying the snapshots. We're only modifying the file system. And then with some later changes that I made to device removal, now we're able to map, like I think I call it map big chunks, where if you have a very fragmented, even if you have a lot of fragmentation, we're able to store the mapping usually with like much fewer number of mappings that cover larger sections of the disk. So the end result is you use a lot less memory for the mappings. So kind of the problem that this is solving is less of a problem. And second, because you're mapping several logical blocks with one entry, all of those logical blocks have to be no longer referenced for us to be able to remove the mapping. So it means that the need for it is less, and also it is less useful when it's less possible to actually take advantage of this remapping and reducing the memory. And then we ran into some bugs with the implementation that's specific to this like subcommand. One that I think Brian fixed, and then another one that is still outstanding. That's a little bit harder to fix and harder to hit. Because this is pretty new functionality that I think probably folks are not using very much, and it isn't really helping us very much. Kind of similar to Doop Dido. I'm proposing that we remove it. We already removed it in ZFS on Linux. In part, the justification there was that ZFS on Linux didn't have any tagged releases with the device removal stuff, and it only just got into Linux pretty recently.
Yeah.
So the discussion here, I think, is to let folks know that that we did remove it on ZFS on Linux, and to propose removing it on the other platforms, Lumos and FreeBSD as well, even though it has been present there for a little while longer, and at least on Lumos, we don't have explicit releases. So in theory, anybody could be using this and relying on it.
Right. It did ship as part of FreeBSD 12.0 release.
Okay.
Like in November or December.
So we may want to look at. I think that on ZFS on Linux, we kept most of the code there, but we did totally remove the command line option. So if you run ZFS remap, it'll just say like, that's not a command line. That's not a thing. Here's the uses message and exit non-zero. So
yeah,
we could consider doing something that has a little bit more backwards compatibility for Lumos and FreeBSD, where it's like you can run ZFS remap and it exits 0, but it just says like, sorry, this doesn't do anything anymore.
This feature is deprecated or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
So on Linux, we actually kept the code. We just disabled it by default. So you can re-enable it to run the CLI command if you really need it. But it doesn't show up as if it's a normal thing. You don't see it in the help, but
I
you can get it back if you really need it.
Yeah, and I think the plan is that at some point in the not too distant future that we will remove the code.
Yeah.
Do folks have thoughts on? I guess there's kind of three options for Lumos and FreeBSD. One is leave it in there status quo. 2 is remove the functionality, but leave the command line option in so that any scripts or anything will select it, and if people type it in, then they'll get a message telling them, hey, it's deprecated, it doesn't do anything. And 3 is just totally remove it, and it's like it was never there.
If you were to ignore, if there was no cost to maintaining the feature forever, and thus we would say to keep it, are there any cases that you know of with the device evacuation stuff where people would still get
Benefit.
a serious benefit from using it?
You can certainly create test cases where it gives a big benefit.
Okay.
The caveats are, it would be pretty hard to get a big benefit if you have small block sizes and fragmentation. If you're using larger blocks, like certainly like 1 meg or above, then it would be easier to see benefit. Even with the default 128K and large files, you could see benefit with the caveat of if you have those to begin with. So with 2 caveats. One is if you have snapshots, then you don't get any benefit, right? Until those snapshots age out and you delete them or whatever. And the other is if you have large blocks, if you're using 128K blocks and your pool's not that fragmented, then probably the mapping it's just not that big to begin with. So yeah, it can do its job and save you the memory. It's just that like the memory that you were using is not that bad to begin with.
Okay.
So that's why it's like, yeah, you can save the like tens of megabytes of memory. I think it's on the order of like tens of megabytes per terabyte removed in the kind of good normal case. So you could save that memory if you fall into this category, which is like not implausible that you would be not using snapshots and using the default record size. But it was really designed for an older version of device removal with super fragmentation where it was using lots of memory. And it was like really important to reduce that memory like any way we could. And so this is the best we could come up with at the time. But the mapping big chunks kind of really reduces the badness of those worst cases of fragmentation. Yeah, and obviously you started that with the caveat of if there was no cost to maintaining it, which unfortunately there is, given that there is a known bug that can, I think, deadlock if
it's a panic.
Okay, if you do the removal, so if you do the ZFS remap while you're doing a bunch of other operations on the file system, like I think it's like if you do the remap and it was like you're doing a remap and then you do a receive, and they're both like, and they hit at the wrong time, then it can panic. I don't know that anybody's seen this in the wild, but we've seen it in testing.
Fair enough. Yeah, I mean, it seems fine to. And again, this is only if you evacuated a device, right? That doesn't.
Yeah.
Doesn't have any benefit if you.
Yeah.
I think we'll on the Illumos end, we'll probably want to think about the option of having like a warning and exiting 0 or whatever, but removing the actual mechanism seems fine.
Yep. Anyone from FreeBSD have opinions or thoughts on this? All right. Well,
yeah. It's a bit strange in FreeBSD to remove the feature in the middle of a stable branch, but it's a new one, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work, right?
I mean, it does work. It's
Word.
Right.
Like it does what it says. It's just that it's usually not very helpful in practice.
Right. And so it probably makes sense to try to neuter it as soon as possible so that people don't come to rely on it.
Yeah, that's what we were thinking as well.
Yes.
And I think the same thing, deprecation warning and exit 0.
All right.
Cool.
I can, I'll put it on my to-do to implement that and open a pull request on OpenZFS Illumos. But if somebody gets to it before me, then feel free. It's probably not going to happen the next couple of weeks at least. Anything else on this? We're making great time going through these things that we've talked about before. The next item that I had was Seraphim wanted to give a little preview of some work that he's been talking about for a while, but now it's finally getting ready to land.
Yeah, so I just want to give an update about the upstreaming of the log space map feature. For the people that are not familiar with it, there are two OpenZFS talks, one from last year and one from the year before. But basically the feature improves random writes in very fragmented pools. And probably not probably, but I actually started opening some PRs in ZOL, basically breaking down the chains to like multiple, like self commits. And I probably got the attention of some ZOL folks so far. But basically the update is that I'm aiming to have a pull request for the feature itself, probably by the end of this week or beginning of the next one. And that was the update.
Okay, cool. Any questions on that upcoming new performance enhancement, which is a on-disk format change? So that's
yes.
Yeah, that's part of the heads up. Let's see. Igor asks, what about upstreaming to OpenZFS Illumos?
I can actually. I initially was working on opening a PR for OpenZFS, but then I decided to. Yeah, okay, one PR will be fine. Yeah, so I can open one PR for the whole feature together with the side changes for OpenZFS. But it might be easier for reviewers to actually, have the split down, like do different commits. But yeah, I was actually planning to do that work afterwards.
Do you, were there significant differences with ZOL? Because again, we did this work originally on Illumos.
Yeah, so they're not that many. They're very little.
So there are a few minor things with like the multiple dnode slots.
Yeah, so that was it was like some difference for like the large dnodes and some tunables because they're handled kind of differently with ZOL. But yeah, most of them were like minor changes. So it might be worth just taking the smaller commits from ZOL.
Oh, you did? Cool. All right. Why don't you give an update on that next then? Any more questions on log space map? All right. Then next, I'm going to add last minute agenda item. I didn't realize that you were that far along. So Sarah, can you talk about fast clone deletion upstreaming status? It's another new feature that has on-disk format implications. That's a performance improvement.
So yeah, kind of similar to Seraphim, this is a feature that was initially developed here on Illumos. So I've opened a pull request on OpenZFS, and then I'm also working on a pull request that I'll soon open on ZFS on Linux. There's not a huge amount of change between the two, but basically it's a performance enhancement for doing clone deletion. It improves the performance of deleting clones, tying that to actually the number of writes to the clone, as opposed to the size of the underlying snapshots. So this is particularly effective when you have a large snapshot and then a sparsely overwritten clone. But yeah, I've done talks about this in the past, and then my PR is pretty in-depth about the design, as well as some performance results and links to other talks if people are interested in looking at that.
And in terms of like kind of code review burden and risk, I would say like the log space map stuff it's like all over the Metaslab code. So like Metaslab.c is like, there's a lot of changes to existing routines in there and changes to like the way things happen. The fast clone deletion is like, it's kind of new, it's just all new code, right? It doesn't really interact very much with the existing code. It's just like, oh, you're deleting a clone and you have this new data structure on disk. Great, we're going to do it this new way. And there's a whole bunch of code to manage that, but it doesn't really interact that strongly. Like there's only a little bit of code that hooks into like, oh, you're freeing a block, add it to this other data structure too.
Yeah, it's mostly in the DSL layer, and for folks who are familiar with snapshot dead lists, there's a lot of similarities there in terms of that. And then also using Zethers, which are the CFS specific thread. There's some interesting stuff with race conditions there.
Cool. And I saw Igor asked about performance tests for fast clone deletion.
It's all in the pull request.
Cool. And also in the talk, there's a bunch in your talk as well.
Yep.
2 years ago?
1 year ago.
1 year ago.
Well, 1 year ago at BSDCan and
okay.
a year and a half ago from OpenZFS.
Cool. Any more questions about that? Tom Caputi, are you on? I think we still have time, so I was gonna ask if you wanted to give an update on the raw, non-raw send stuff. Sounds like he might not be here. I guess I'll just briefly say, I know Tom is working on a fix for encryption that we think is the last issue that we're seeing on the Illumos encryption pull request. And the issue is if you do both raw receives and non-raw receives and then raw receives again, then the MACs are wrong. The MAC being the like cryptographic verification of the block. So you would get like a invalid checksum or something error. So he's working on a fix for that. It's a little bit involved with some on-disk format changes, and he's working on how to make folks that are already using encryption aware of the change that's being made here. But I think for new pools going forwards, it's definitely a very straightforward fix here. And I think he's looking at opening a pull request on that soon. Or he has a pull request open that we've been discussing, right?
Yeah.
All right.
From our end, though, that is, I think, the last outstanding issue that we're aware of. We should be able to get towards getting that put back.
Awesome.
Once that's sorted out, I think. So.
That's sweet. I'm so looking forward to having encryption in Illumos landed. Like most of like all these projects that we've been talking about that we developed on Illumos, like we wanted to upstream them a long time ago, but it's like there's encryption and then there's redacted send and receive and all these things. Like it's just easier if you do them in order, right? So, because then there's almost no code conflicts, and so we kept putting it off and putting it off. So it'll be really great to see that. Clear up for other changes going in. Okay.
Oh, I think for fast clone deletion, the question was, can I share the tests themselves, not just the results? And yeah, I can add those in. I have high-level descriptions, but I'll add the tests themselves.
Cool. All right, so we're doing so great on time, I'm amazed. 2 remaining items on the agenda. One, this is from the backlog. The question was about event and fault management frameworks, and I guess the question is like, are we doing all different things on each platform, and should we unify them somehow? I'm not sure who added this, but I'm pretty sure that there are different frameworks on at least Illumos, Linux, and FreeBSD. At least on Illumos, it's like the existing framework is like Illumos system-wide, so it's not just ZFS. So it would be hard, I think it would be challenging to, you know, make changes to that. And that may or may not be the case on other frameworks, but on other platforms. So yeah, the question, which I posted on the chat, was, you know, should we port FMA to the others? And I'm not really in a great position to answer that, but I'll open it for other folks from Linux and FreeBSD to talk about, you know, how their frameworks came to be, and if porting FMA, all of FMA might make sense or not.
I can speak to that, Matt.
Mm-hmm.
I think Justin and I gave a talk like 2 years, maybe 3 years ago. So that's a good point of reference. And in the Linux code, we emulated enough of FMA to get the functionality that the modules needed, like the CERT engine and a few things like that. There is a pretty, there's a document inside there's a README in that code. So if anybody wants to kind of read up on that, they can. And I can let someone from FreeBSD speak on that. They have their own similar thing where they emulate basically the CERT engine.
I mean, the core.
John, when you say we, that's on Linux, or where did you do that?
Yeah, on Linux, we had this thing called Zed, which ZFS event daemon, I guess. So we pulled in. There's a retire agent and a diagnosis agent in Illumos. So we pulled the code verbatim in and then just wrote enough emulated FMA code, you know, to make it just work. So right now we share the same 2 modules with Illumos.
For some context, the rough architecture of FMA is that there are a bunch of sources of reports, which are basically little events that contain things like this VDEV had this had a checksum error, or this disk had an IO error, but it recovered, things like that. And that all gets funneled through the sysevent pipeline into a daemon process, FMD, that runs. It's like a user mode process, not a kernel module, that also collects events from lots, as Matt says, lots of other parts of the system. And the thesis of that is that we can then correlate errors from, say, the disk subsystem, which is obviously not in the ZFS code base, with things that happen at the VDEV layer. But then there are, as Don says, a bunch of modules that respond. So we tie the events together into cases and diagnoses, and then modules can take actions to automatically resolve cases, or in response to groups of fault telemetry that are all correlated together. So they might spare in a device, they might offline a disk, things like that. But it's definitely like, I think trying to do it, all of that, just inside ZFS would mean that you'd leave out the opportunity to correlate with lots of other sources of telemetry in your own operating system that are often necessary for certain kinds of fault diagnosis. Like, I mean, one thing that we've hit recently is like you might have disks that are presenting IO errors or checksum errors, but then maybe you've got 8 disks in your system that have those errors, but then they're all behind one SAS expander, and it might actually be the SAS expander that's the problem, and you don't necessarily want to wildly fault out a bunch of disks, which might just like cause serious pool redundancy problems when the problem is somewhere else. And it's difficult to be able to make that determination automatically without correlating fault telemetry from multiple sources, of which ZFS is just one. So that's why FMA is as a broader system is interesting to us. For some context.
I will say that it took us a long time to get FreeBSD ZFSD working adequately, and I'm very hesitant to mess with that. The difference between it being too twitchy and not twitchy enough was art to get that working right.
That's a big challenge with fault management systems.
Yeah. A lot of people bled on that code, and I'm not necessarily willing to abandon that work.
Yeah. All right. Anything else for that discussion? Cool. So I will close the meeting with those. So those are a bunch of great, pretty much non-contentious updates, and I think that's good. That's a great use of this meeting. I'm also like, we're going to have more contentious, more lively discussions as well going into the future. And the last one that I wanted to throw onto the agenda today is the OpenZFS GitHub repo. So a couple of questions have come up around this and the future of it, given the context of the development moving more towards ZFS on Linux and other platforms taking changes from there. So let me give some background information, which is that really there are kind of two reasons that we created that repo. I created that repo. One is we wanted to make it easier for folks to get changes into Illumos that weren't necessarily like existing Illumos developers. So for example, porting changes from other platforms to Illumos. And so, being able to use, have those folks use GitHub, pull requests, have automated testing done for them, and then have other people go through the RTI process and kind of know how to do that for them. That was kind of the main motivation. And I think that motivation remains to some degree. The second motivation was, publicity value. It's for folks who aren't necessarily core developers to see like, oh, like OpenZFS, there's a GitHub repo, so it must be like really a thing. And I can see code there, and I can like see activity, and that's good. And I think both of those are valuable, but really the first one, helping people make technical contributions is by far more important to my priorities for the project. In my opinion, like at least the technical need there is still, like there's still value. Like people are still making changes in Illumos. We're talking about pulling changes from other platforms even more in the future. So I think that there is still potential value there if people want to use it. I think in terms of the kind of publicity value, we might think about like maybe renaming the repo or something to make it, if we want to make it clear that like, oh, this is, maybe not where all the main development is taking place. Maybe there's more stuff in ZFS on Linux, and we can like update the wiki to point people there or something. I think that's like not really a huge deal one way or the other, except for maybe people getting confused about like, like the OpenZFS repo is, behind or like doesn't have much activity. I think that is a perception problem that we can kind of manage in several different ways, and I'm not too concerned about it. I'm more interested in kind of getting feedback from people who are interested in doing the work on Lumos, hearing from them if the OpenZFS GitHub repo and test framework is useful, and if so, speaking as one of the people who is like has both worked on setting it up and it does take a lot of work to maintain it because like we're doing manual testing as well, and we're opening RTIs, and we're kind of coordinating the discussion between the Illumos process and other contributors. And most of that has been Prakash, who I don't know if he's on the call, but thanks a lot for all your work on that, Prakash. Because Delphix is moving to doing more of our work on Linux, we won't have as much time to put into maintaining the OpenZFS Illumos stuff going forward. So we'd love to start a discussion with people about, how useful is this? And also who, if anyone, would be willing to put in the work to keep it going and keep, kind of greasing the contributions from outside of the Illumos community to Illumos.
For what it's worth, we're looking at within the project itself, trying to stand up some of the things that you're doing for us this year. So like we're going to go get some Jenkins infrastructure or whatever it is, like to do more visible, externally accessible, like automated testing of things. We got some bugs to go fix to make it easier to run certain kinds of guests on different virtualized platforms to make the testing experience easier to orchestrate, I think. But we've got kind of a plan to get that stuff done, first half of this year. So while we appreciate having the thing and all of the work that you've been doing, I think that it's on us to take that over, first half of this year and get provide the facilities you're providing and try and get the engagement to be sort of more directly within the people leading the Illumos project itself, rather than this thing that you're sort of having to push in the side, basically.
Yeah.
So that's definitely something that we're looking at.
That's awesome. I mean, I think that's the ideal solution, is that the Illumos project itself becomes easier to contribute to.
Yep.
And that's great to hear. Do you know if GitHub is any part of that plan, or I only heard you mention the testing stuff, which is great, but I know that the familiarity that people have with GitHub is also beneficial.
Yep. It's good. We're looking at lots of different options.
Okay.
So, yep. That's all I have right now.
All right. Fair enough.
Yeah.
Well, we were finishing the meeting 6 minutes early, which is amazing. Are there other thoughts on the OpenZFS GitHub repo or questions that I didn't answer with the background?
Oh, for what it's worth, if you do want to rename the existing repo to be called Illumos something under OpenZFS, that's fine with us too. That's, by the way, just.
Yeah, probably. Since that's like a publicity value kind of thing, I would probably wait until, like, Illumos has made some progress on the things that you talked about, and we've made progress on making sure that changes that go into Linux get onto other platforms and all that, so that we have more of a complete story there before making kind of largely visible changes. But that's good to know.
I wonder if it makes sense to also maybe use it to coordinate some of the other stuff we had talked about, like making sure that any on-disk changes are coordinated across all the platforms and so on. maybe that happens in the ZFS and Linux repo, but I don't know if it makes sense.
What were you thinking more specifically? I know we talked about coordinating before, and that was mostly just around like sending out emails to make sure that everybody knows. Did you have some more code?
Well, there's an item in the agenda for next time or whatever, I think, about it, isn't there?
No.
Seraphim had an item about making sure that on disk changes that we like reserve flags and numbers and stuff, like when we added the Z standard flag reserved for the send stream format so that it doesn't get clobbered and so on.
Yeah, I think that we had a discussion about that a couple meetings ago, and at least at the time, the decision was basically that, hey, let's make sure that everybody knows about this stuff by sending email to the developer at OpenZFS mailing list. I sent some emails to all the various lists, kind of letting folks know that that's where it would happen, and I did see a slight uptick in subscriptions to the OpenZFS developer mailing list after that, so I took that as a good indication that the message was received. So I think that's probably all that. I don't know if you had thoughts beyond that, Seraphim.
No, what I wanted to emphasize mostly was people doing porting work and making sure that, maybe even if they don't want or they don't have time to port a feature, make sure that maybe they put some padding on things like the overblock or other on-disk structures, right? Just to make sure that, we don't introduce like some hard incompatibility between operating systems. That's what I mostly wanted to emphasize, because I actually had to do some of this work back when I was upstreaming the ZPool checkpoint, and we've added some fields in the overblock, but there were also some changes from ZOL for the MMP changes. We turned out fine, and everything was good. It would be good to keep an eye for things like that in the future.
Yeah, I think letting folks know, and then also making sure that we open pull requests on the other platforms to reserve fields and stuff like that. I know Delphix, we both been almost burned by this several times, and we've also almost burned other people on this several times. So we could definitely do better as well with this. I don't know if, in terms of something that we would keep in a repo, I think email, email communication is that's certainly the first step. I don't know, maybe it makes sense to have something where some of these structs or descriptions of them, or a text description of the on-disk format is kept in some common repo, and the expectation is you modify that before you push to any platform, push any on-disk format changes to any platform. That could be an option, and that's something that we could create a repo for that under the OpenZFS account, anytime that somebody is willing to do the work to populate it to begin with.
Yeah, and I would say that's the first thing too. Whenever you're opening a review or a PR or something like that, make sure that you maybe highlight the actual on-disk changes. So I think that would be the first thing, and then obviously communicating. Sure.
Cool. We'll move that to items discussed. Awesome. Karen, are there any housekeeping items for this time or next time? All right, I see you're shaking your head. Awesome. Well then, thank you all for a great meeting. The next meeting will be in 4 weeks, and it'll be back to the normal time of, is it 1 o'clock Pacific? Yes, 1 o'clock Pacific. And I think we'll figure out what the right cadence is for switching between the 11 o'clock and 1 o'clock meeting times.
Sounds good. Thank you.